afternoon. Before I get started, I want to say a very warm thank you to the organizers of our discussion today, to ITEL, Likta, Infobalt, Fisk, Digipoli, and also to Microsoft, better known as Skype and Nokia, somehow bought by an American company. I know I am incredibly grateful for the tech industry in Estonia, and in particular, the organized way in which they work through ITL in how they contribute to our work here. And from the interactions I've had with the other associations here today, I know you make the same contributions at home, and I'm grateful that you're also convening us together in a more regional conversation. You are incredible partners to us. You are not, you are not lobbyists. In my mind, you are our partners in the work we do at home and the work we do internationally. And so I just want to thank you again for this convening and for bringing us together. I don't think we'd be having this conversation today without you. I mean, factually, we wouldn't. So what I want to do is I just kind of want to talk a little bit about how I see the challenges that we're framing today from the perspective of two hats that I wear. Because on the one hand, and my formal title is Undersecretary for Digital Transformation, I'm responsible for the digital transformation of public sector IT in Estonia. On the other hand, I'm also responsible for national cybersecurity. And I was just giving another talk where I was talking about the ways in which cybersecurity and doing good public services and digital converge, but they also sometimes are at odds. And I think one of the things that I deal with intellectually on a daily basis is how to bring these parts of my portfolio together in a way that is complementary and not contradictory. And that, I think, is in many ways the focus of our conversation today. So if I start with sort of very broadly how I look at my task in digital government, and I know from discussing with my colleagues in Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland that it's the exact same challenge set that they're thinking about, it's that we have all built technically and functionally very impressive systems for delivering public services in the digital sphere in the last 20 years. I could tell you why Estonia is a tiny bit better than Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland, but the reality is we are all world leaders in this space. And that means that we have gotten a lot of things right. We've built fantastic application layers, we have national EIDs, we have an incredibly wide swath of services that are built on top of those. And yet, we are failing. And the reason we're failing is because the expectations of our users, our citizens, and our enterprises are not grounded by, is e-government in Estonia better than it is in Germany, but are the services I get in Estonia from the public sector as good as what the private sector provides me, whether it's some interesting, new tech startup or it's Teams. And generally speaking, they're not. They're not as user-centric. They don't use the same. They don't have a user interface that is nearly as good. They're not built on the same technologies. The various ways in which those services get delivered are not meeting those expectations. And behind that is the fact that government is not on a daily basis in a brutal competition for the user. We are not sweating over product market fit and whether our users are happy on a daily basis. And we need to get there. We need to get to a culture of service delivery that is really focused on the impact that our users have on, that our services have on users, that are also focused on some other values that I think have become clear to us as very important, especially in the last couple of years. One of those is flexibility and agility, the ability to deploy new services, not in months or in years, but in weeks. And finally, cost effectiveness. And I don't actually like cost effectiveness as a phrase, but I'd say leanness. We all have small governments of whom our citizens expect that they provide the full range of services of a welfare state. And the only toolbox I know for how to provide all the services of an incumbent effectively while on a shoestring budget is through the methodologies of a lean startup. And so I think the question we get to is, how do we bring that to the public sector? And there are a lot of shifts. There's a mindset change. There's a lot of change in how we do work. But a big part of that is the ability to use mutualized infrastructure and the ability not to have to build it all ourselves. Some of that is cloud, but it's not just cloud, right? It's also taking government-specific applications and building them together collaboratively, whether that's through NIS, which we're now doing with Finland and Iceland, whether that's through GovStack, an initiative to build 20 e-government building blocks on a global basis, or whether that's perhaps even more valuably through encouraging a GovTech sector where we can actually take public functions and turn those into business models carried out by the private sector through APIs. We've done this well. We have a history in all of our countries of useful PPPs. I'm happy that Kalev is here, who embodies sort of the role that PPPs played in setting up our EID scheme here. But this also gets us into some trouble, because the countervailing tension or the countervailing pull we have right now is in the direction of worrying about our dependencies. Whether that's phrased in terms of digital sovereignty, whether that's phrased much more prosaically in terms of concerns around availability, whether that has to do with the very difficult questions we've been asking in the last 4 months about not just Russian and Belarusian companies, but even Russian and Belarusian nationals in all our IT. The way in which tech today isn't just technological, but is also political. The dependence that we have on our technology infrastructures means that we cannot simply say that we buy whatever the world provides. We are indifferent to the nationality, the provenance of our technology, and that means that we are in a really messy gray space. And I say that messy gray space, however you view, sort of whatever your position on the spectrum of these policy questions is, the fact that we have lack of clarity hurts us. We in Estonia right now are 2 to 3 years behind on our 5G deployment. It's now finally happening because we had a big argument around Huawei and our networks. And it took the government and the sector that long to figure it out. We have our government cloud plans have stalled again for many years because of the interaction of legislation and security standards and a very conservative approach to risk management. Now, both of those in these particular instances are problems that I wouldn't say are fully solved, but are finding solutions. But I guess my prediction to you is that problems like this are going to be part of our bread and butter for the next decade. And we're having a discussion right now around cloud certifications in the EU. There's a question of how, on the positive side, all Western democracies work together to engage with the sort of countries in the middle who haven't fully kind of taken a line on the China-Russia debate, such as India, for instance. And there's also the very practical question of needing to rebuild Ukraine and how we collaborate there. And I think the point I would say is we'll talk in substance about what those common visions look like in the panel discussions we're about to have. But my hope is that when we talk about the four of us, we move from collaboration and cooperation, which is something we already do very well. We do it governmentally, the private sector does it well, to actually doing things together, to sitting in the same room, articulating requirements together, shaping our positions and building our products together. Because fundamentally, our needs are very similar. We have leverage both as government actors, but also as private sectors when we don't just more or less do the same thing, but actually build the same thing. Anyone who's in the technology space knows that the difference between two different products that more or less meet the same spec versus something actually built to the same interoperability requirements or a harmonized product, there's a very big difference. Differences in bits and bytes make a difference. And so the more we can actually bring our actions together, sit in the same room, and actually have the same position, everything from the same position papers to the same products, the stronger we are. And that's true in our kind of mini-lateral collaboration here. That's true in the groups that we sit in together, whether that's the Nordic-Baltic group. And I'm very happy that at least now in IT, really Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are sitting behind the table very actively in the Nordic Council of Ministers, working together on pilots, for instance, around EID, whether that's in the European context. I think that we have a lot of wisdom to bring to this discussion around security versus functionality, because on the one hand, we are all very security conscious, and we don't have a choice. It's not the elephant in the room, it's the bear who I hope isn't in the room that we all deal with. But at the same time, I also think we have a much more outcome-oriented and pragmatic culture around some risks. I think if we compare ourselves to other countries in Europe, I won't name names, when it comes to cloud, when it comes to how we look at acceptable risks with non-European but friendly countries, our focus is on building services at work and is on win-win. And I think that voice that is both security aware but ultimately focused on openness is a voice that Europe needs to hear and that the world needs to hear. And so with that thought, I really look forward to having these discussions. I'd maybe close with a particular area where I think we can work on this question of not just collaborating, but really doing things together. And that is a common task that all free societies will have in the years to come, which is to rebuild Ukraine. I know that Finland in particular has taken on the task of rebuilding the Ukrainian educational system as a whole. Good luck to you. We're happy to contribute where we can. Our PISA test scores are almost as good, sometimes better. But seriously, this is going to be a task for all of Europe. We will all, I know that all of our tech sectors are actively going to be working with their counterparts in Ukraine. And I hope that as we do that, we also work together from a common playbook. I know that I will put on the table that we as government should do so. I hope that the sector does so together, because a Ukraine that is strongly rebuilt, that is even stronger with its digital economy than it was before the war, is ultimately an asset for all of us. And so with those thoughts, I thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Lucas. It's always so inspiring to listen to you. And I guess we can all agree here that the challenges that all our Baltic countries and also Finland are facing are the same. So I'm very much looking forward now to start our very first session. And I'll be moderating this session as well. Cybersecurity and beyond, enhancing security cooperation between the countries. So I'm happy to ask our panelists to step on the stage. As we have now all these 5 experts together with me here on a stage, from all these different countries that I mentioned already many times. I wouldn't use too much of a time on introduction of the topic, because I don't think this topic needs any kind of introduction. And maybe just let's get to the point already, and starting from here first, Peter. What has changed when you think about your everyday job, or just the kind of approach to cybersecurity now as the war started, and how much has the war in Ukraine influenced your everyday job right now?
Well, first of all, we are much more busy. That I can attest to. The fact is, from our perspective, is that the sort of EU agenda, European Union agenda on cybersecurity, digital security, has been already there. And it was a busy agenda, and sort of rolling on all the with all the scope of the portfolio, all in all, has been rather active. But since the war broke out, there has been much more concentration of not only will, but also the sort of general worry of, let's say, the public and also policymakers have sort of put a lot more interest to what is the effect to the digital environment. And the discussion is still ongoing from how I see it. And there is, I wouldn't say that there is clarity yet. So the discussion continues.
All right, but when you think about, and we'll get to the other speakers in a second, I guess when Finland made a decision that you guys are going to also join NATO, the following step was that there were cyber attacks against many national, like also institutions. So do you think that we're going to see this also going even stronger in the future? That there is a political statement, and then we will face another attack as well? Because it has been like this, which is not Finland, but also many other countries. Estonia was organizing cyber exercises here in our NATO CCD SUI, the next second attack against the system. So do you think that we're going to see more and more often cases like this? A political statement, an attack fully?
Yeah. the risk certainly is there. I think there are 2 points. From our perspective, the question is more on our adversaries, that where their focus is at any given time, and how their sort of resource and capability spread is at any given time. Because of course we can all understand that at the moment there are at least 3 fronts looking at from the perspective of our adversary in the East. The second point on this is that maybe the situation all in all is something that, well, maybe I'll put it the other way. We don't have a giant spark plug in our society like you have on the ones who have seen Star Wars movies and know the Death Star, that in the center of the Death Star you had the giant spark plug when you flew in using the Force and then shot a couple of lasers to it, the whole thing exploded. We don't have that in our society, or nor any of ours. So I'm not sure what kind of outcomes there actually will be. We do expect that things will happen, but what is the impact remains still highly unclear.
All right, let's jump now to Latvia and Lithuania and also hear your thoughts as well here. Either Egons or Mindaugas, who would like to start also. How much the entire war and the increase has the amount of attacks against your systems also increased during the war?
Yeah, I'll start. Thank you. My name is Egons. I'm from LMT Latvia Mobile Telephone, and we are seeing significant increase of attacks since war. And these are more just DDoSes. If initially groups, well, I wouldn't mention names, but those, well, teenagers from neighboring country were doing very simple things that we had everything ready and we didn't suffer, and well, we noted them, but it didn't harm at all. These days, we are seeing much more sophisticated attacks to our infrastructure, and what is scary that they have done their homework. They checked. We use a lot of technologies. It's a big enterprise. It's mobile technologies. It's regular IT. It's cloud. It's more, and they have done homework. They've investigated what we use, how we use, and trying to target the weak spots. And we have had little outages. No network was down, but we've noted them. That's one, so to say, negative side. Good is that we learned a lot during these, well, exercises or attacks. Interestingly, which didn't happen ever before, we receive threat emails, and well, in Russian language they say, as due to your extensive support to Ukraine, you're going to be hacked, etc., which is new. We never received a political statement before because we're a commercial organization providing a lot of IT services, telco services, etc. That's new, and there is one little area where I feel better. Recently, we had a very long internal discussions regarding supply chain. And we were banning supply chain from suspicious third-party countries for many, many years. And a couple of times I was thinking, well, do we really need to be that saint and really ban a little tiny library made somewhere in the north of Russia? And yes, the answer is yes. And these days we do not have any new topics or new challenges regarding supply chain. We are decent already. I know that quite a few companies these days struggle. They started to evaluate really their suppliers only when the war began. So in that respect, we are a little bit less stressful work.
All right.
I'm putting my title, I'm free and independent human being, and I'm freaking out. From the beginning of the war, I'm freaking out that we are completely unready, and we are still not talking about the essence, what is happening and what would happen in our region if such something happens like that. We are still talking about cybersecurity as there is a software infrastructure. Actually, we are completely vulnerable, and I'm telling the politicians in Lithuania, and I'm telling politicians in Estonia. If I remember correctly, I used to work in Estonia 2.5 years as a head of one of the mobile operators. 8x chops, and this country has no connectivity. In Lithuania, it's the same. 8 cables. We have many providers, but it's 8 physical cables, which you chop, fiber ones, and then there is no service outside. It's the same with the electricity. And then, I'm freaking out with our ministries. They are coming and they are saying, oh, guys, we need a redundant internet connection. And when the providers are asking, do you have a diesel generator? No. So you don't need any redundancy on connectivity if you don't have a redundancy on energy. And even if you have let's say, if you have a diesel generator, usually it stands outside the ministry where anyone with the Bandera cocktail or Molotov cocktail can throw on it. So we are not ready on infrastructure layer at all. And what other mistakes we have been doing, we have concentrated our data centers and our data into the exact spots, which are easily targetable. Estonia and Lithuania done the same. Latvia, I know it's also done the same. And if you look what happened with TV tower in Kiev, then imagine what happens with your data. If you look what happened in Kharkov, if you have the data center somewhere in the governmental offices, or they are concentrated everywhere, that blows up in one rocket. So we have to change completely our mindset and IT security doctrine, moving towards the distributed systems, moving towards the blockchains. We should, moving to cloud is a necessity. Everybody is busy right now in Ukraine, moving the leftovers of what they can move to the cloud. They had the same stupid laws, which I was promoting as well in Lithuania, that all the data should be kept in one country. And once the Russian boots on the ground came, I changed my head. No. Everything has to be outside. And it should work simultaneously. No backups and no great solutions with the digital embassy or keeping the backup outside is helping us. Why? Because if you lose your infrastructure on the ground, with this supply chain, when a Cisco Wi-Fi router will be delivered in 463 days, at least in Vilnius, you will not redo your infrastructure to get the backup up. So we are still talking like nothing happened. Ukrainians, okay, imagine Mariupol, put that in Vilnius. No digital services for anyone, and we are so used. So it's so easy to make a panic in our country. We don't have a depth. We don't have possibilities to withdraw from Mariupol to Kiev or to Lviv. It's only 300 kilometers. So our services should be working even if we become island. And our services, digital and governmental services, should be working if it's occupied, that the government should be able to work in exile. So we need to completely rethink the way how our IT infrastructure, energy infrastructure, software infrastructure, data center infrastructure should become ready for such an event. This event was completely unlikely, but it happened.
With this note, I would like to jump back to Finland and to talk to you, Susanna. You are working as a government affairs director for Microsoft. What have you suggested to the Finnish government? What has been your biggest lessons? Because Microsoft have massively been infected by this as well and affected in all different kind of ways. What has been your suggestions, or if you could give any kind of suggestions to the public sector in Finland today?
Well, thank you. I think some of that was already to some extent said earlier. So I've been in my current role in Finland for 2 years, been in Microsoft for 8 years. To put that in a context, for the past 2 years in Finland, one of the key messages that I've been having is that you cannot have all your data in one location. You need to have a decentralized approach. And in Finland, we have this thing called resilience, which is built into the government strategy, the preparedness thinking that we have, going to the energy sector, the supply of food and all of that, which to some extent pops up quite frequently as, in order to be resilient, you need to have all your data in your country. And luckily last fall, the first new security requirements that were made for health sector, for primary healthcare, they actually decided to go to the decentralized approach. you use the whole EU space for having a data location. And that's the primary that I've been talking the past 2 years, more or less on a weekly basis, and increasingly so now because of Ukraine. That's the main lesson learned from that.
But do you think that what happened in Ukraine right now, and I guess everybody can agree here that this is the largest cyber war we have seen? And there is a cyber war happening.
Yes.
Because in media, when people are discussing and saying, no, actually, I mean, the main thing, military, obviously, this gets the most coverage. But we can't deny that there is also a lot happening in cyberspace today in Ukraine as well. It's just they are more resilient as well when they were back in 2014, because the war has been already going on since 2014 in cyberspace, right? I would now jump to Lucas, back to you, an Estonian case. There was a lot discussed also here about having decentralized system. This has been the key element also for Estonia. Has there been anything changed in our mindset now? The biggest lessons we have seen, I mean, again, going back to the Ukrainian war, have we changed something in our policies as well? Because as we can see, many countries already have.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I think there's an interesting question about what our exposure has been, and then maybe the point to make here is that because the main effort of the cyber war has been, from Russia, has been toward Ukraine, and because Ukraine also has done a good job defending itself and firing back, I think a lot of the more interesting Russian capabilities have been tied up there. And if we are in for a multi-year, much sharper confrontation between Russia and the West, then we should expect that won't remain like that. And so our situation in cyber will become progressively more difficult. And we will see increasingly more sophisticated attacks. And the interesting thing is, I mean, Daugas talked about the physical layer in addition to the cyber layer, and there's also the kind of the informational layer, and very much the Russian doctrine has been combined all three. I don't know if they've executed very well on joint operations, but in principle, we see them acting in all three spheres. And I would say that the challenges on the physical layer are absolutely shared. And the trick here is certainly our mindset has shifted, is anyway shifting toward being more cloud friendly. I very much hope that as we go forward, what we've seen from Ukraine pushes us much more aggressively and quickly in that direction. But we have to solve this dual problem that we've already talked about here, which is that we both have the ability to operate without the infrastructure in our country, but also have services in our country operate independently. That is not cost-free. And we're having a very tricky discussion. And we're getting approached by many sectors right now here in Estonia saying we have a requirement of the ability to operate in Estonia when connections are cut off, and that this is expensive. And I will say that there's a fair point to it. And I think the challenge for us is to also be creative. Creative on the resilience of the communications infrastructures, to not just say resilience means more fibers or sort of a 0 to 1, if things are cut off, things don't work. I mean, I think Ukraine has started to show us what this creativity looks with their use of Starlink, but I think that's only the beginning. Satellites, mesh networks, and some frank discussion on risks, because in spite of the risk of being cut off, I mean, what is the risk that every single undersea cable and the connections through the Suwałki Gap are cut off? It is not 0, but then the question is, what else is happening in that scenario? And what do we really need to have functioning? There are probably registers and systems, both public and private, that if they don't work, that's okay. And so I think we have to get a lot more granular than the restrictions we have right now. And this is a conversation that we clearly need to have with all of us. And I'll just throw one last bit in here. I think geographically, the three Baltics in particular, with Finland, unfortunately, we only have the undersea connection or the connections to St. Petersburg, which have other problems. But between the three Baltics, we actually have fairly nice contiguous borders between us. And while I'm sure there is a slight increase in risk when you cross borders and jurisdictional things, it's a very minor increase. So as part of a very practical approach, we should also think about how our regulations and rules recognize that physical contiguity and take advantage of it, because even at that level, I think there are cost savings, there are combined market powers. Many of the companies that we're working with, the big problem they have is that they are regional enterprises. They are trying to run a single IT structure across the enterprise, which is absolutely correct and which we should encourage as much as we possibly can. And if there are just ways in which we can align our rules there. So this is a conversation I'm starting to have in particular with my Latvian and Lithuanian colleagues on how we can do that. And in the meantime, if all the communications geniuses at Nokia can figure out how we can quantum tunnel between Tallinn and Helsinki and pretend that there is a non-sea connection, then let's make the bubble bigger.
That's nice. Before I jump to my own next question, we already have received questions also from the audience. Thank you. And I encourage everybody to ask your questions as well. We have 5 speakers on the stage today, so you have your chance. I'm going to take the very first one here. I don't see a name of this person asking the question, but the question is the following. What concrete cooperation between 4 countries would be significantly improve the security posture of our societies, and what is standing in a way of doing that? Peter.
Okay, let me address 2 things. Actually, also from the perspective of what Lucas just mentioned. One being the cost issue. This is a more maybe simple to illustrate. Anybody who knows by heart of what a risk matrix is, looking at likelihood and impact, and those things, those risks that are on the lower right corner, they are the ones that are highly impactful, however unlikely. Those are the ones which are considered too costly, unless they come to life. Then they are more valuable, and that's the question that when we operate, and our governments seem to quite a lot seems to operate on a scenario-based risk thinking, which in my view is slightly, I don't want to say outdated because it's still useful. It's definitely useful, but we need more fluid, more data-driven risk management approaches, first of all. And the second point is when we come to the cost issue, that it may be that when we are at the lower right-hand corner, that's where possibly some share and pool and share type of approaches could be helpful because of the cost element there. Another point is that when we are looking at the sort of data domestically or maybe outside of the jurisdiction of the owner of the or the state who owns the data, the question is that from this kind of war scenario perspective, which was unlikely, as we have noted here, the thinking has been that the risk for confidentiality of that data when it's outside of our own jurisdiction has been considered higher. And now we have come to to a situation where we would have to do the risk assessment again and see that, okay, what has changed? What is the data that the information is actually showing to us? And when we start to think about the jurisdictional confidentiality risk for the data, then we would have to understand, this has been very difficult in Finland. The thinking has been dichotomical, meaning that it's either Finland, which is then confidential and reliable and so on, and anything else is an acceptable risk. But I honestly believe that we have, like we have in other fields of government operations and other human activities, we understand that this is not black and white. Other jurisdictions, other countries could be more reliable than others. I have sometimes said that, for example, Rwanda and Sweden are not the same. When you make any kind of comparison.
Totally. Agnes, from your side, some concrete examples how these 4 countries could, or just remarks as well, what Peter was saying.
I'll quickly jump and remark on your, these were comparison of countries, that's very true. I would say that Finland is very different from Cyprus, for example, which is much closer than Rwanda and Sweden for multiple reasons. If we go to the very concrete things, what we could do, I believe in one of the best regions in the world regarding cybersecurity, which is Nordics and Baltics, we have a lot of inefficiencies. We have a lot of security people, from policy makers to security engineers and then cybersecurity specialists that work in very decent jobs, but they do redundantly the same things. We touch the same vulnerabilities, we assess the same partners, we do risk analysis, and we do not almost never share anything. It's increased domestically in Latvia. Since the war, we have much more collaboration between critical infrastructure, security people, because they are overloaded, they cannot cope with everything. That has improved. Unfortunately, it's due to war. Previously, everybody kept their secrets secret, and that's it. So I would say that in this region, if we find something that is very important, or might be important to quite a few things, we do not reanalyze it in each and every, not just company, but even country. So we have it available to security specialists. And that would be great, because my people are also doing all the supply chain management, and we're talking national security agency, et cetera, which I believe we are doing 100 more companies just in Latvia, and probably everybody else in the region as well. So that is one thing. There is another thing I would like to touch is we do not mention it so much, but it happens. It's a digital transformation of physical security. These days, everything is digital, from your camera to building management system, even sensors and fire sensors, alarm systems, etc. And those, if they are not exactly in a critical infrastructure inside it, they are sometimes left a little bit behind, and they are not properly managed, patched, governed, so to say. And I would see that this is also a broad topic with could cooperate in the region, that this physical security is very important. We see with a lot of examples that it's not just hacking your computer, it could be something more, it could be power station, it could be something, and not everything is air-gapped, so they are somehow connected, at least sometimes, somewhere, and this is what we could take good care of by cooperating.
Mm-hmm. All right, now I would jump to my own question, and then again, I have seen your questions. We're going to come back to that as well in a second. But when we talk about the EU role to play here, I myself, and I'm also responsible for EU relations, so I know how many initiatives and actually how much money the EU has to offer to increase our capacities as well. If we think about how can the Baltic countries and Finland I would say play the best role there in order to increase the EU capacity as well there. You want to go for it, yeah, Sanna?
Yeah, I would link to the call to action point. I think the gentlemen were giving really good call to actions already, but here's another call to action related to the EU. And I think we have all these countries represented here, like-minded, well understanding the threat landscape. And we would need to have all the countries to be proactive, specifically right now, for the European cybersecurity certification dialogue, to ensure that we actually keep the EU space. It's available to have, like Lucas pointed out, the pragmatic, outcome-based solutions for security, because that will help us to have friendly, user-friendly solutions at the end. So there's a lot of dialogue taking place at the moment where I would appreciate, from our point of view, if we would see these countries taking a proactive role and driving that cohesive digital single market also for security, and not having these sovereign protectionist blocks that ultimately doesn't help none of the countries represented in here.
Right. Any reflections on that? What we should do
I
on
would
EU
say,
level?
as in other things, to go from collaboration and cooperation, which we do anyways, to really doing things together. So I mean, both on the industry side and on the government position side. Frankly, these processes are very cognitively intensive. A lot of materials to work through, analyzing them has a lot of overhead. Larger countries do it better. I see a place even there to pull and share resources. To be very frank, the main challenge is a language one, because it means changing working languages to English in practice. And so that sets some barriers. But on a lot of these more nuanced technical discussions, I mean, actually saying, let's develop the position together instead of just saying, let's coordinate our positions. And the same thing for sort of the domestic questions. There are places where hopefully we're getting to an EU outcome, right? So for instance, certification, but we're not there yet, and we can kind of start doing things together more quickly. So for instance, in our new government cloud framework, we'll have a whitelist for cloud service providers. And basically Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and many others have similar setups basically. Microsoft has the resources, and we all use Microsoft enough that probably Microsoft will go through that, and probably it will be whitelisted by everyone. But what about a lot of smaller enterprise software as a service providers? Do we mutually trust each other as whitelists and bring those close enough that if something's been whitelisted in Latvia, Lithuania, or Finland, that I can just say that's great, and you don't need to sort of check the service provider again? Or we talked about information warfare, again, a place where the ultimate outcome is European cooperation. But right now, there's very practical tasks around monitoring Russian media. So if you want to make a legal decision against a media outlet, you need to, of course, have the analysis done on whether the content they're spreading is, in fact, violent, hateful, call to whatever sort of inappropriate action. It's the same content that we're monitoring in the same Russian language, applying the same laws. So the analytical capacity, again, sharing that, pooling that, I think a lot of places where until Europe gets to the point of really doing these things together, we could set the example.
Right now, I would jump to one of the questions that have got a lot of votes in our workshop. It's a little critical question here as well. Is there a risk, in fact, that 3 largest cloud providers are centered in California, US? And when we think about what would happen if politics of a cloud provider clashed with politics of an independent country who buys cloud services? Who wants to take that?
I will take it. I'm independent here. No, there is no risk. We should stop being a North Korea in EU. We are, all of us, NATO countries. So what we are saying that it's the biggest NATO country is an enemy to us. We should stop being silent about that. Europe should stop doing the crazy thing about protectionism which is happening, and should stop thinking that regulation is key to every solution. It's not about that. It's like thinking, the problem is that our governments or our politicians are still thinking about church books. They are moving documents, they are not moving the data. There is no such a concept yet. So when they are thinking about the data protection, that the document in Finland, it's a very safe one, but document in Lithuania is not safe one. It's not like that. Data, if it's encrypted data, nobody can see nothing what is there. So I don't think that that's a threat. The threat is the EU behavior of building protectionism and thinking about that somehow we can be better than the technologies which has been developing for 30 years.
So I would not say there's no risk. And I think it's fair to be direct about risk, right? I mean, there is I'm not worried about the confidentiality risk that much, but there is absolutely a continuity of service risk. Obviously Russia's had that risk manifested. If you've built your services on Microsoft or Amazon stack, well, you basically, it's a little more complicated because not all Microsoft customers are frozen out, but many are. There's a pretty good chance you don't have that Microsoft stack today, or all Amazon customers. However, the question is, how big is that risk and how do you mitigate it? And there are other risks with AWS or Microsoft around lock-in and so on. So you should anyways be thinking about what are your dependencies on them as a vendor, whether your architecture is locking you into that particular one, or whether you're using a containerized architecture that anyways could move workloads. And then you accept some risk. I mean, I think the reason I don't want to say there's no risk is the whole problem in the paradigm we're in right now is that someone finds a risk and then we don't do something. And we actually have to get to the point of saying that all activities have risks, also not going in cloud is big risks. And it's a question of weighing the risks and making a calculated decision. And that is something that everyone in the private sector does anyways all the time, every day. It is very tough for us in the public sector to get to a sort of risk acceptance footing. And so all I would say is everyone here in the room who can speak intelligently about that, please help us with that, because that's something we anyways have in cloud more generally, something we have around being able to it's not just the risk around the security, it's risk around procurement. We have to become more risk tolerant and intelligent about risk.
Peter has a comment, and also then we're going to jump to you. So.
Sure, I will continue directly on that. it's easy to identify and recognize the procurement risk. However, I would still maybe like to highlight the confidentiality risk that personally I think that it does exist at a level that it is a genuine concern. I'm afraid that our, let's say, state apparatus systems are not coherent enough to be able to say, although I would like to say that we are NATO partners, that somehow establishes the adequate level of trust. But at the same time, our security intelligence services do not exactly match the sort of, let's say, foreign policy, defense policy, military defense policy side. There are other things, which means that the confidentiality risk really is indeed, firstly, personal data risk. Well, how severe that one is for an individual, that is another discussion. But the second point is that, for example, private operators like companies and so on, they have valuable commercial data and information, and they certainly are concerned. It's not adequate to say to a company that, oh, you're NATO country, so why don't you just put your business secrets to anywhere where you have a NATO country. I'm afraid that it's a little bit more that we have to sort of address that side as well.
We had Susanna.
Can I remark just?
Go ahead.
2 remarks.
Yeah.
The biggest leakage in Lithuania has happened from the social security system 2007. It was a guy who downloaded everything. So it's not about the location, it's about the system and architecture. And as you know, also in Ukraine, not a single rocket hit the empty tank with petrol. All the hits was exactly to the full ones. And you know where the information comes? Tax authorities. Because of excess tax, they need to follow which one is full. If you download it, you can get it. So if you have a single point of downloading all the information, it doesn't matter is it in your country or is it outside. It's here where you need to start looking for the data leakage protection. Sorry.
A tiny remark on this topic. Again, I will not say there's no risk, but there's a point to make here also, which is we get very focused in Europe on the NSA risk, and we forget the Bundesverfassungsschutz, Bundesnachrichtendienst risk, the FRA risk, etc., and even with each other, right? I mean, the GDPR does not cover national security data access. There is a capability gap, obviously. The US has much higher capabilities. And the question, so you get into this risk discussion, and the risk is there, and then the question becomes, what are you going to do with it? And there will be categories of data, hopefully not very many, where you do actually say, I'm not going to let out of my territory, including things that are in a governmental sense, sort of top secret. They're going to, if you're a corporation developing really advanced tech, there are things you will keep on-prem. I mean, cloud is not a solution for 100% of everything. I'm happy to see Susanna nodding, but let's be intelligent about the risk. And again, let's have that relative discussion. And maybe the NSA risk is even a little bit bigger than the FRA risk, but how big is that difference and how much does that affect our choices?
I get the word for you now.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for that. And I fully agree. I mean, as a cloud provider representatives, we do not expect everybody to go fully on cloud either. It's fully understandable that you go through these risk categories and understand certain percentage of your data that you would never put in anywhere. I think as a tech company and technology companies, we need to work every day on trust. It's a paramount for building and making sure that people can use technology. So I think it's healthy to have these conversations, and these conversations need to take place, because that's the way to also have a dialogue and understand where the concerns are and how to mitigate those concerns and how can we find the solutions for them. So I think it's healthy to have a conversation like this.
One tiny remark. Cloud technologies and cloud itself, it does not replace your business contingency and disaster recovery plan, and that's very important to keep in mind.
All right, I will jump back again to you, Susanna. There is one question that is directly for you here. Do you think we can security certify ourselves out of threats, or security certifications would be just side activity for market protection by EU?
Okay, complicated question. I don't think we can protect ourselves just by doing certificates, if I understood the question itself. I think those are important. They drive harmonization, and I think this is what EU is trying to do, which is very applaudable. We should try to drive harmonization. If the certification is the way to do it, we should do it. But by harmonizing, we also want to have agnostic approaches to ensure we can have, as earlier said, the pragmatic outcome-based solutions. Standardizations, I would say, again, I think it was Lucas probably earlier saying how much we could do together as countries if we use the same baselines instead of redoing everything in every country. And that's why the standardizations, best practices are out there to be used for that purposes, to support the lack of resources or the lack of time for driving the better security.
Yeah. We discussed today a lot, again, the lessons we have learned, and then we are changing our policies. There is a question regarding this as well, what I would really like to also address here. What Baltic and Finland should do, especially what we should learn from the Ukrainian situation in order to be more ready for risks coming from Russia. Do we really have to wait this kind of hit and then change our policies? Or should we do again? I mean, obviously exchanging experiences when one country has been hit by something, we change our policies. But is there something that we can do in order to be one step ahead of Russia today? Yes, Peter.
Well, simple answer, short answer is once again, it's about the likelihood and impact. When something is still considered less or even unlikely, it's very difficult to convince the sort of change to the policy when the other elements or the risk vectors still do exist. And that seems at least to be the sort of way of thinking in Finland. And that at the same time relates back to what Susanna just mentioned about the sort of harmonization objective, which is definitely a good one. There is one aspect which is really critical that we should all carefully consider and really focus our attention to, is the fact that when we talk about the harmonization of sort of technical requirements, we should really stick with that and not get confused with, for example, issues of sovereignty requirements and other things that we have the discussion ongoing in the European Union at the moment, that sort of via technical certification, there are elements that really do not belong at that level. Because the sovereignty requirements, that is a trade policy issue, internal market issue, protectionist question of protectionism, all these kinds of things, and we should really have other players to discuss on this as well, and not only technical experts.
Any remarks also? Yeah, Susanna.
Yeah, I think probably, I mean, we talked about the modern security tools and risk management, all that, and sharing information as an important topic. But I want to pick one that Lucas briefly mentioned, and that's the information space. Because the threat actor that we all talk about here is very active in disinformation. And I think we need to constantly keep that in mind also from terms of media literacy. And we can't just look at technology, but also media literacy, that we have the skills in the countries, but also in the disinformation space, understand how you can use technology to understand what is starting to bubble, because that's where you start seeing what's going to happen maybe and predict the upcoming activities. But also how the certain actors that we all talk about here is very actively targeting the minority groups. How do we make sure that we build inclusive ecosystems and communities and societies to ensure that we are resilient countries in each of the countries we are talking about here?
I would say that all the layers, which we named, it's infrastructure layer, energy layer, infrastructure, cyber layer, information layer, there is plenty of space for cooperation. If you start for the communication layer, so if we are talking about some redundancy of our fibers, it should not be placed in each country. It could be the internal on all the countries, including our. Yeah, that's a no-brainer to start doing. Then if we talk about cyber layer or the software layer, when it was the last time we had some exercises together? When military exercises happens, then it happens, yeah. But when it was the last time LMT was hacking Telia in Estonia, and Lithuania was hacking Tele2, and that was a friendly exercise to get ready. When it was the last time the national cybersecurity centers engaged with the private sector to hack, when it was the last time there was $1 million in bonus if some government of ours has been hacked. Never. We think that if there will be a physical attack, we will be all of us, men and women, who are going to defend. When it's a cyber attack and we lose, we don't talk about failures. What would be a great... It's difficult to copy the success. It's so easy to copy the failures. We don't share about that. We don't talk. It's, all the cyber threats which we have had, or even hacks, we cover under the table. We are not, it's not cool to talk about that, but we should, at least in closed groups, not on the stage, should start talking. And talking with the companies who are protecting us. We have contracts in place with Microsoft. I know Lithuanian government has it. I believe all of us had. When it was the last time we switch it on? When we had a real thrill of the cyber attack on us? Never. So that's the place to start. Then Ukraine teaches us that the first attack happened on satellite communication. They burned out the satellite phones going even to the Germany because some wind power lost connectivity. So do we have how many these untouchable resources we have in our 4 countries? Do we have routers in our 4 countries that we could share if something burns out? Do we have switches on no, we are trying to do it one by one. And that's the cooperation. Information field. Daily attacks happening on our politicians, on influencing minorities, spreading the news. Now we have attacks on Ukrainian refugees, that these people are coming and taking our jobs, or why we need to care about them. It's coming from the same sources. So we have plenty of cooperation fields. We should start now.
Lucas, we have a couple of minutes now until the end of this discussion here. Any final remarks from your side, how to make our positive lessons or just these kind of success stories more heard between the Baltic countries and also Finland?
Well, I've been writing down some ideas to take up on a practical level with my colleagues. Douglas just added one, which is, we do actually do lots of intergovernmental exercises, but our exercises that are joint public-private are usually nationally siloed. And a regional exercise that is public and private. Maybe we start with sectors would actually be really valuable. You mentioned telco sector, so maybe a very concrete idea, we should put that into work right now. I want to come back to the question that you asked about lessons learned from Ukraine, because there's one very interesting takeaway from what the Ukrainians have done, which is that it has reminded us that a strong offense is a good defense. Ukraine has very effectively degraded Russian cyber capabilities, or aimed to degrade them. They haven't been successful in all places in a few ways. The first most obvious one is that Ukraine has been engaged in cyber activity against Russia, both clearly in a state-organized manner as well as Ukrainian individuals acting against Russia. I leave through discussion on international law, the sort of international ramifications, but the fact is they themselves say that has an effect on their capability. Second of all, Ukraine has very actively been seeking sanctions against Western technology companies acting against Russia. And part of that is sort of the economic effect. But their results, not against the Western technology companies, sanctions preventing Western technology companies from acting in Russia, to be clear. There is a very clear capability effect, which is undermining the ability of actors based in Russia to actually have access to the tools and the infrastructure they need to do their work. And finally, there's also a question of demoralizing the individual actors. And we all know that Russian cyber power has been a hybrid sort of conglomerate of, yes, proper people working for the government, but a lot of organized crime. A lot of those people have clearly some amount of obligation to the government, but it's a little bit more loosely organized. And so if we demotivate people, we sort of have them drop out of the capability roster that government has, that also contributes. So I think we should not shy away from not merely talking about our defense, but also talking about the various means in which we prevent the bad guy from being able to mount an offense.
Thank you. Your final remarks, Susanna.
Yeah. I would echo what the previous speakers have said on the collaboration, and I think that Ukraine has actually thought that really well. We've been working for 24/7 with the Ukrainian government since before the war already, but specifically when the war started, to share the information as we spoken earlier. It's so important that we get actors, it's just not us, there are other actors as well, sharing the information, giving the patches for fixing the problems. That's how you protect the government.
All right. This leads us to the end of this discussion, the first session here. I guess, again, we all understood there is no way of going back. And if by our experience we can make the world a better place and cyberspace a little safer and continue to help Ukraine as much as it's needed until they win the war, also in the cyberspace, then we have a lot of work to do. But before we are going to go for the coffee break, I also have a small presents to our speakers. So a very big applause and thank you to Lukas, Egons, Mindaugas, Peter and Susanna for your expertise here.